Everybody, my name is Chris Mallet, and I'm the co-director of the California Conservatory of Music here in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I'm really excited to sit down with my good friend, guitarist, and composer, Thomas Flippin.
It's a pleasure to be with you again, Chris, one of my favorite guitarists. Happy to talk with you.
Thank you. So the Ex-Aequo project is something that I think the guitar world has needed for a really long time. And you're involved with the other composers in the Changing the Canon project. So how did you get involved with Ex-Aequo?
Well, it was interesting. At the height of the pandemic, Phil Goldenberg and some of the other members had reached out to me just, like shortly after I think George Floyd passed, where everyone was kind of trying to reimagine the future of our country and society and just classical music in particular. And, so they reached out to me at first. And it's, things just didn't work out between us because there were so many things going on in the world at the time and all these other things happening. But then months later, they reached out to me again. And I think this all came about because they got like a really great grant from a university in Texas and also from, I think, the Augustine Foundation that allowed them to kind of pursue this project. And when we reconnected later, we were able to make it work. Like our schedules aligned and it just worked out. And then they kind of gave me tons of freedom to write about whatever I wanted. They just gave me a time limit. And yeah, that was it. That's how it all got off the ground.
Great. This is the first time I think that anyone has seen a project of this size with composers of color writing for solo guitar. And I loved your piece. I thought it was amazing. I've always been a fan of your work, and I've played many of your pieces in the past, and Phil really did the piece justice. And the piece that you composed is called Not One Shall Leave. So can you tell us a little bit about this piece and some of the backstory? I know it's based on a story in the Bhagavad Gita, correct?
Yeah, so this piece came about because, COVID was happening. I think at the point where like the commission finally came through, I don't know, something like 400,000 Americans had died at that point. So I had been writing other pieces kind of dwelling on that. And so there was this moment where I was thinking like, man, everyone's dead. Like, what is the point? Or like everyone's dying. Should I be wearing a mask? And like all these things that why aren't people wearing masks? All this stuff going on. And I just remembered this like part of the Bhagavad Gita from this Hindu scripture called the Mahabharata. Because my wife studied South Asian languages and civilization in college. She studied abroad in India. So she'd always talk to me about these things in college. And it's just this incredible passage. The 11th book of the Bhagavad Gita, it's like there's this warrior prince who has an existential crisis as he's on a battlefield looking at a rival army. And he's not sure, like, should I kill them? Should I fight? I thought it was bad to kill people. So he's like freaking out. And then all of a sudden, God herself, Krishna, comes down from the sky and like has a conversation with him. And finally it gets to this point where like she shows her true form, right? So like thousands of heads, gnarly teeth, eating and devouring thousands of soldiers, setting the sky on fire. And she gets to a point where she's so terrifying to him that he like literally like can't look at her anymore and like begs her to stop. So I was just thinking about that passage, like, yeah, lots of people are dying, but the god of time, Krishna, is going to kill us all anyway. So it's just like, doesn't really matter which route of death that you take. Anyway, that's a long-winded thing. So it's this incredible passage, tons of imagery, and that's what I based the piece on. Like just this incessant ticking of the clock, just like time is killing us all, and just try to imagine like you're this hero or this like character in your life, and you've got to decide how do you live knowing that time is going to kill you eventually. And that's what it's like the piece is wrestling with. Like time is coming for you. What do you do with that information? Do you live righteously? Do you, cower in fear from the world? Like all these things. And like, it kind of has to do with like, what is your pandemic response? Some people started baking bread. Some people started woodworking. Some people succumbed to pleasures of the world, So that's what I was wrestling with when I was writing the piece.
So when they asked you to write this piece, did you have this story in mind already? Was this something that was brewing, or were you kind of just trying to think of an idea and we're reading different passages? I mean, how does one come up with a piece like this?
So like Nina Simone has this great documentary on Netflix. I can't remember like What Happened, Miss Simone, or something like that. And there's this footage of her saying like, how can an artist not reflect the times in which they live? So like it's just, how could any of us not be thinking about COVID and all these people dying, and like George Floyd being killed, and like all this hardship happening in the world. So that was in the back of my mind. And then yeah, funny story, the actual piece, I kind of came down to the wire with the deadline. So like I wasn't really sure what to do. I just knew I wanted it to somehow be, kind of like a powerful theme. And then I had a dream. And in this dream, like I don't remember anything else about the dream, but I had this dream where I just heard this incessant rhythm, just like da 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 da, and it was getting louder and more intense. And like I woke up and I was like, holy crap, like that is a powerful feeling. And I was like, this is the universe telling me like I should use that and see if I can build a piece around this one simple rhythmic motif, just da 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 da. And like the dream, I felt so intense when I woke up. Like I wrote down that rhythm, like I voice memoed myself, singing that groove, and then just trying to come up with like ideas above it and stuff. But that's what launched the piece. And then it was just a matter of developing music around that motif that kind of matched the story I was trying to tell. So I started with that, and then like each piece is a chance to try something new or like explore a different part of your personality. So I was trying to come up with like, well, what the heck do you put over that rhythm? And so I started with the first movement first, the prelude. And so I had that rhythm, and I was like, okay, I need to come up with some sort of like cool texture, like an orchestral kind of theme, like melodic theme. And so I screwed around and started dabbling with 12-tone composition. The opening melody actually has all 12 notes of the chromatic scale in it. And I thought that was like an interesting thing to play with. And I was trying to, looking at a lot of 12-tone music. And I hadn't written in that style before. So I thought that was like actually a pretty cool thing. And I really liked the melody. I thought it was dark and really captured the moment. Yeah.
Cool. And what are some of the what's the story behind the Allegro? How did you start? Did you also kind of just build off from the Prelude, that rhythmic motif, or did you kind of branch off into something different for the Allegro?
The Allegro, I thought for a piece like this, where it was going to be two unified movements, that like they should be like really unified. So like, just like as a compositional thing, like it's really good when you can develop ideas and have them come back in different ways elsewhere. So the second movement kind of started by me just taking a little snippet from like a couple of measures in the first movement, and then just developing that idea, breaking it down. And that's what the opening of the second movement is. It's just like these couple of measures from the first movement, and then just broken apart, layered on top of themselves, adding all these other notes and harmonies around it, and then building off that, and then developing the idea by taking this little, like chromatic gesture, and then shifting it up to different chords and harmonies. Yeah, and then the middle section of the second movement breaks it down even more and takes the two basic elements of the piece, like this little chromatic gesture and then the rhythmic idea, and it sequences them on top of each other. And to me, what was cool about that, like I said earlier, like in the Bhagavad Gita, there's this moment where this prince is like begging God to stop showing her true power. That's what I was thinking when I wrote this. It's like so dissonant, so ugly and gnarly. And that's like the moment where it's so ugly and hard to hear, just please make it stop. And that's like the halfway point of the second movement.
Yeah, very cool. And then when you compose this piece, I mean, I think out of 9 total composers, you are the only classical guitarist, professional classical guitarist of the bunch. Not, you don't have a different instrument, is not your main instrument. So when you compose a piece like this, are you sitting at the guitar? Are you thinking about the guitarist? Were you thinking about Phil and his playing style when you're composing this piece, or were you writing it at the piano, or just kind of piecing ideas together, separately and putting them together? How do you kind of go through the process of writing a work like this one?
Chris, you're such a great interviewer, man. These
Oh,
great
thank you.
questions. I wish I had my composition notebook, because I'd show you, like, my wife thinks I look like I'm insane, but it's literally just like a bunch of music theory ideas, sketches of like the structure of a piece, all sorts of harmonies and scales and modes that would work with them. But for this piece, it was starting with the 12-tone idea, and then just like all these, it was mainly at the piano. It's like the piano and just working stuff out on a scratch pad in terms of like harmonies and modes, and then figuring out, like, once I've got a sound and a scale, then like figuring out, okay, well, this is the gesture I want to do. How can I make that playable on the guitar? And that was the cool thing about Phil Goldenberg, because he came to this with like like such a well-rounded knowledge of music, like he had some experience dabbling in jazz, he had experience playing rock and roll. So like when we were talking, he knew what a power chord was. Like he knew how to play it, how to get that grunge rock sound. And so like even though, like I composed it in a certain way, but it really was Phil being able to bring those ideas to life. It was like this cool combination of him being able to play it and me trying to make it playable on the guitar when I moved it from the piano.
And were you teamed up with Phil from the beginning? Like, were you working with him before the piece was even written to talk to him about what he wanted, or is this something that you were teamed up with after you started? Like, were the composers and the guitars kind of together from the beginning?
That's a great question. No, actually, we weren't. So I didn't know exactly who I'd be writing for, but Phil had told me that he really dug a piece I had written before called Neverland.
Yeah.
And so once he told me that, like I instantly knew, like, okay, he's down for like super dissonant, super crazy, cool rhythmic grooves, kind of far out at times. Like as soon as he told me that, I knew like I had freedom to write whatever I was feeling. And to your earlier point about, I'm the only guitarist in this group of composers, I felt like that was an advantage to me, and also like a warning, like I had to be cautious, right? Because you don't want to be like the guitarist composer who's writing like this cliched stuff that's like not nearly as deep or musically interesting as what like more traditional composers are writing. So I knew like I wanted to write something that was really groovy because I'd seen a lot of what Phil had done, and I suspected that Phil was going to be the one playing it. So I wanted to write something that I knew that would be groovy, that would be virtuosic, because with a project like this, you want to make something that's going to have like mass appeal. Because like Phil Goldenberg, Hannah Murphy, Evan Taucher, they have like insane social media presence. So like a lot of people are going to see it, and they might not be like hardcore classical music lovers. So you want to get something that can catch people instantly to make the project more likely to be successful. And I think the piece succeeds in that. I think it's got an opening that's like really, really catchy and piques your interest, makes you want to know what's going to happen next with this little simple idea.
Yeah, I mean, on the guitar, it definitely is. I'm not a composer myself, but have worked with a lot of composers with you. And one thing that, definitely is a worry is that you'll fall into just, what the guitar can do, or your own limitations or your own strengths on the guitar, or just, like planing chords around. But it's really cool to see that motive start right from the beginning, just kind of grow from that single note, rhythmic motive, and grow from there. Something that you don't see on the guitar a lot. It is more orchestral. It kind of reminds me of, maybe Ravel's Bolero or Gustav Holst's Planets or something like that. It's kind of really nice to hear that orchestral feel on a solo guitar. So were you thinking of something more orchestral when you were writing it? Something that's bigger than just a solo?
Yeah, absolutely. So for this one, I was just like, man, this is an epic story, so it needs to sound bigger than a guitar. So like I just wanted to make it like as dramatic as possible. Themes and like a lot of the things I love about orchestral music are when those basses come in, right? Those lower instruments kind of take over a theme, and you hear it underneath all this other stuff. There's like crazy stuff happening above. So like, for example, in the first movement, it's like I've got this low theme, but then there's like just every once in a while, there's just like a really super high thing out of nowhere. And to me, that's like the orchestral writing that I was thinking of. It's, like, oh, here's the piccolos coming in with a little ditty. And like this kind of really spreading the register of the guitar out. There's low, there's high, there's middle, and really trying to take advantage of that range that the guitar has in a way that I haven't before.
Yeah, definitely comes through. So with your pieces that you write, do you always have a story in mind? I mean, I've played several of your duos that you've composed, Ten Kingdoms and Soldier Sonata. There's always some sort of story or something based on literature. Is that kind of how you always come to a piece? Do you find something that you're interested in and turn it into a musical form, or you just kind of first start composing something and then think of a story that you're interested in to apply it to?
It's a great question. I think it's both. I think what I usually do, I have hundreds of recordings of me when I'm practicing guitar. I'll just like be improvising textures, detuning the instrument, trying to come up with, I'm just like screwing around doing technical exercises that I'm making up. And then every once in a while, I'll come up with something like, ooh, that's good. like I should save that. And so I've got like hundreds of little ideas from when I screw around on the piano or screw around on the guitar, and I just save them. Sometimes I like write stuff out in notation software, and then I save that, and then I come back to it sometimes years later. And so a lot of it is that, like, I just have these ideas that I save and I don't know how to use them yet, right? So for this piece, like, some things are like a groove or a gesture, like I came up with it like 7 years ago or 10 years ago, and this was the piece where I was like, it makes sense to use that and develop that idea and now make it more refined because I'm better at composing than I used to be. So that's the first thing. And then I can't actually come up with how to use the thing unless I'm inspired by something in the world. And, you know, so like usually for me, it's like I see a piece of art, or I remember some book that I read, or there's like a news story that's happened, like, and I feel like I got to have some therapy and get this out in a piece, you know, and then the audience is just the people who like get to watch my private therapy session. I'm really writing the piece for myself, you know?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, but I guess like I really enjoy music. That's why I really like playing your pieces too, and listening to them, because I think playing a piece of music that is based on art or literature, it makes it a bit more interesting for the audience too, because as they're listening, they can really imagine something to go with the music, you know, so they're not just
Yeah.
sitting there just listening to notes, you know, they're understanding that there's a story behind it. You know, I just always been a fan of programmatic music, and I love that you do that.
I would add, like, you know, I heard Clarice Facade describe this way in a really good way. It's like a reverse soundtrack. Instead of making music to match, you know, like a pre-established scene, it's like the music inspires you to create a scene in your own mind. Like you get to imagine the story that's being told for yourself. So honestly, I think like nearly every composer has some sort of scene or mood in mind when they're writing a piece, unless it's like a purely like an academic exercise, right? So like you're writing this thing, like you're still thinking of like times in your life when you felt happy. You're thinking of like times in life when this music would make sense to hear when you're composing it. You know, I think all music is kind of programmatic in that way, unless it's like a student exercise or some purely like mathematical thing you're writing. So to me, it's like, I often wonder, should I even mention like what the source material for this stuff is? Like, what if I made this piece and I didn't say like, hey, I got this idea from the Bhagavad Gita? Does it make the piece any different? I just think that's like an interesting question, you know? I think it's better, and my wife agrees, like it's better, like you said, for audiences to have something to latch onto and to see themselves in the art that they're hearing. Like you were saying earlier, you know, like it's really, really important that things aren't too abstract for an audience, especially if you're writing music like me that's kind of dissonant and a little weird. It's like really good for the audience to be able to latch onto something like, oh yeah, I can imagine what that would be like to like have God come down from the sky and terrify me, you know, like now you're engaged in a different way. So yeah, I really like having something to base my music on other than just like pure harmonic and melodic structure stuff.
Very cool. So with this project, I guess, do you feel that it is getting out there to an audience of, you know, younger composers of color who may be interested in jumping into the classical world or classical guitar world? I know that's part of this project, you know, is to inspire, it's to put out really good music and for people to listen to this music, but also I think part of the mission is to inspire young composers of color. Do you feel that that's being achieved? Has anyone reached out to you? You know, yeah, I'm just curious how this is being disseminated and who it's reaching.
That's a great question. I would say I have seen the reach in terms of like colleagues from around the country who are familiar with the project and familiar with the pieces and the piece that I wrote in particular. I've seen it in the people who purchased the score from my website or who've gotten the full collection from Ex-Aequo's website. I think really for me though, and also in terms of the press and like great things like the Omni Foundation kind of showcasing this project, for me, I think the thing is like the press is really great. So now, but more importantly, before this project, if I ask someone like, hey, is there a lot of classical guitar music by African-American composers, modern African-American guitar composers, not Justin Holland, not, you know, Scott Joplin transcriptions or something like that? Most people would say, not really, or they wouldn't even know. But now it's like definitively you can say like there are at least 9 pieces. These Ex-Aequo commissioners have done this project. here are several composers you can check out. And a lot of these composers are brilliant, you know, like they're award-winning composers. They have like incredible residencies. So I think if nothing else comes from this project, now there's a record. There are pieces lifted up, professionally recorded, so people can be exposed to it and can pursue those composers further if they wish. And if you're an aspiring young classical guitarist, composer of color, now you can look and you can see, man, here are 9 people with incredible composition training who have devoted their lives to this thing that I'm interested in. I'm not the only one. I'm not, you know, like isolated. It's not like an oddity if I choose to become a composer myself, right? Like it's a normal thing that many other people have done. And now you can see yourself in that. And more importantly, you know, the problem with a lot of these projects, like the way it gets framed is that people are like, you know, this is good for young minority classical students or whatever. Or, you know, like if you're playing women composers, it's good for women students. No, this is great for students who are not classical guitarists of color, because now they can see, hey, here's some killer music written by someone who's not of the same ethnicity as me. So this tint is much larger than I imagined. And it's like if you go to Africa and you see it everywhere you go, there's black pilots. You know, it like completely changes your worldview because you don't see that as much in the United States. But when you go there, you're like, this entire continent has a bunch of black pilots. Like that's cool, you know, and it shifts how you perceive things, you know, outside of your own cultural sphere.
Yeah, and all of the pieces, you know, are extremely accessible. They're great pieces of work. You know, I'm happy that of you know of the composers that Ex-Aequo chose, that it's, you know, it's just, they're great pieces, and that's what it really is. Great pieces played by great players that I think will definitely get out there and hopefully just have everybody start playing them. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. The playing is first rate, really phenomenal. The video work, and you know what's really nice about how they did this project, the composers are so different from each other. You know, some people are like super tonal and very audience accessible, and some composers are so far out and dark and crazy music, which is really, really cool. I'd like to think I'm somewhere sort of in the middle, or maybe more on the far outside.
Probably somewhere.
But I think it's really cool that there's something for everybody, you know, like there's high art, there's more accessible stuff. There's fun stuff like dance kind of music. I just think it's a really cool, well-rounded project for various difficulties and like skill levels of players and audience taste.
Yeah, awesome. So before we end, do you have any advice for some young composers who may be looking to compose for the guitar, either a guitarist or non-guitar composer?
Yeah, sure. The first thing I'd say is the best thing about your music is the fact that you wrote it. So never feel bad that you don't sound like somebody else, because you writing it is what makes your music your music. So really embrace, you know, who you are and your musical taste. And the second thing I'd say is just study. Like learn as much about music theory as you possibly can, because it's like being a painter and giving yourself more colors. You know, it just lets you tell much richer stories if you broaden your vocabulary about music.
Excellent. Great words of advice. Thank you, Thomas, for joining me. Thank you to Richard Patterson and Breg Urias at Omni, and for Ex-Aequo for putting on this amazing Changing the Canon commission project. I hope that there are many more projects like this in the future from both Ex-Aequo and just anyone else looking to really broaden the repertoire for everybody. So thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening.